In this tutorial we will learn how to build a photorealistic Earth. For this we'll first set up a detailed base surface with mountains and city lights, then add a layer of clouds which cast realistic shadows, and finally create a simple atmospheric effect to blend everything nicely together. So in this video here we're going to be discussing how we build a shader for this Earth in here. You can also transfer this to various other types of planets, of course. We're going to be breaking down several aspects of it. First of all, we're going to be discussing about how we can generate these kind of like nice base surface in here with these nice speculas here in the ocean parts, and then also these kind of mountains which are basically illuminated by our sun position, and they even cast some shadows, so that looks quite nice. And then additionally we have this kind of like layer of clouds here on top, where we also have this effect that they cast some shadow here on our surface, so it creates this kind of layered effect here. And we also have some city lights which are illuminating our Earth here in these unlit parts. And lastly we will have this kind of nice atmospheric effect here that brings everything together. And as you can see, this shader here renders pretty much in real time, very fast and very efficient. So we're going to be building all of this in here. As usual, you can always find all of my scene files on my Patreon, and there's also a whole course on car rendering if that's, for example, interesting for you, so you can head on over there to check this out. But now without any further ado, let's just jump into here and see how this shader was built. So what we have in our scene is just a basic sphere with one light source that basically emulates here our sunlight. And then we have this kind of like star environment map here in our background, so that we don't work with complete darkness, but we have these kind of like nice stars in here. Just makes the whole thing look a little bit more realistic. And now we can start to bring in some textures. So speaking about textures, those 5 textures here are the ones that are required to generate the final effect. And if you want to use the same ones like me, as said, you can find them over on my Patreon. So what do we have here? Let's start with the diffuse map, which is responsible for the basic color information of our planet. And then I have this map in here that I use to break up the glossiness of the surface. And then I have here a displacement map, which we're going to be using for surface details. And then we have 2 additional maps. One is here a map that has some cloud data in there, which we're going to be using to generate some clouds. And then a self-illumination map, which is a little bit difficult to view in this kind of small preview, but it basically just contains a lot of city lights, so areas where there are a lot of cities, there is some illumination going on. And this we're going to be using in order to bring some city lights into the dark parts here of our planet. So instead of starting with the diffuse map, let's start with the displacement, because at this state right now we can see much better what's going on. So for this we're gonna select here our Earth, and then let's add a V-Ray displacement modifier. And of course we need to load our displacement map. So once this is done, you can see we have these kind of nice mountains here already showing up on our Earth. So at the moment we have the amount here set to 1 centimeter, and there you can already see that we're not really working with physically accurate scaling in here, because remember we're working with a whole Earth, or a whole universe rather. In this kind of like scenarios, it's oftentimes not really practical to work in real world scaling, so just don't be confused that this one here says 1 centimeter. And if you want to know a lot more about those displacement settings in here, I have my own dedicated video tutorial that you can find in my channel. So now let's zoom in a little bit and see what we have. And you will notice we have some nice details here already going on, but it looks overall a little bit soft. And that's because we would need to subdivide this mesh here a whole lot more in order to get more finer details. And as a simple trick, I'm just going to use here the displacement map and also put it into the bump map. And then once you do this, you can see there's a lot more details here going on suddenly. And now it's only a question of how you want to blend this, because at the moment it would be a bit too strong. So let's use a value of, for example, 5 in here to just blend our displacement map and the bump map a bit nicer together. And I think like this, we can leave it for now here as our surface details, and then move over to the diffuse map and the specular map. So for the diffuse map, it's very simple. Let's just load here our diffuse map into the diffuse slot. And then once that's done, you can see now we have here some colors showing up. That's already quite nice. And now the only thing that's missing is some reflection, because at the moment this whole earth here is completely diffuse. Let's increase here the reflection amount to 1. And then also let's put a base glossiness here of 0.6. And then once you do this, you can see that there's already some specular highlight appearing here in this area, which is coming from our sun. You can see this also is reflected in our surface details here of these mountains, for example. At the moment, of course, this looks very boring because it's very uniform, and that's what we're going to be changing in the next step. So let's move the highlight here a little bit more to the ocean area, and then we can bring in our specular map, also using a V-Ray bitmap. And then once this is done, you can see we have a different effect here already. I'm gonna go now into the output option and enable this color ramp in here to just be able to control this a little bit better of how I want the result to look like. So for example, I'm gonna add like this kind of output curve to it. And by this way, you can see that we break up here the surface a little bit, or the specular highlights rather. So let's use, for example, something like this in here, so that we have not so strong highlights here on our continents, and then more stronger highlights here, or more specular highlights here on the ocean. And then if we want to, we can blend this a little bit better. So remember, we have this base value here of 0.6. So we can go inside and just play with our glossiness blending value in here. For example, something like 50% or maybe 75%. And then you can see that the transition here looks nicer, and we have this kind of interesting highlight here on our ocean. And at the same time, it's not so visible on these kind of land areas of our planet. So now the only thing we have to do is to basically add some kind of nice city lights. You can see at the moment here, these dark parts are completely black. And you would imagine here in those parts to have some kind of city lights. So let's add this in the next step. So for this, let's move to this self-illumination part in here. Let's add a new composite map. And then let's move this one into this slot in here so we can know what's going on. And then here as a base, let's use a new bitmap, and let's load our self-illumination map. And then you can see that now we have these kind of like nice city lights which are appearing in here. The only problem is that we also have these lights appearing in these kind of lit parts already, and that's not really how you would expect it. So we have to find a way that these kind of lights in here are only showing up in the areas where there is shadow. So for this, let's go into our composite and let's just add a new layer, and let's add a fall-off in here. And now by default, it uses this perpendicular parallel fall-off. Let's switch this one here to this shadow light fall-off. And this one basically can see where the light is and where the shadows are, and you can define different kind of colors in here. So in this case, we would need to flip these two colors because we want to keep this part in here. And then let's add another point in here and define the output curve like this here, for example. And now you can see we have no self-illumination here and a lot of self-illumination here. And now the only thing that we have to do is to basically multiply this here on top. So we choose this multiply blending mode. And then once that's done, you can see that all those lights in this area here disappear. So if I make this layer here to 0, you can see we have all of those lights in here, which doesn't look realistic. And if I put this value here to 100, then you can see that those parts here in the lit area, they disappear. And now we only have these kind of lights appearing in those unlit areas. Now we can just go inside and define the blending amount. Maybe this is a little bit too strong. Yeah, so I think like this, we should be finished with our base surface. As a last step, we can just enable here the maps in our viewport. And then in the next step, we're gonna move over now to the clouds. So the clouds themselves are set up fairly simple, but they can generate some nice effects because it just adds another layer here on top of our base surface. So for this, let's just take our base surface, let's duplicate it and call it clouds, and let's apply this dummy material here to it. And then also let's delete this displacement modifier. And now you can see we have this kind of like gray sphere here. And in some parts, because we have some displacement for our mountains, those mountains here are still coming through our clouds. That's not what we want, so we add a slight push modifier here on top of it. We give it a value of 0.5 centimeters, for example, to just slightly push the clouds on top of all of our mountains and so on. And then we can just give it here some white color, add some kind of reflection and give it some really low glossiness values, for example, something like this. And now the only thing we have to do is to add an opacity map in here. So let's go into this opacity slot and let's load a bitmap here, which would be this one here, responsible for the opacity of our clouds. And now you can see we have this extra layer here of clouds on top of everything. Let's just go in here and show the shaded maps here in the viewport so that we can see what's going on. And now we can even move those clouds, for example, to somewhere like this. And you can see we have these nice shadows which are under the clouds. And I think overall they just add a lot of realism to this overall appearance because you have now multiple layers. So now as a last step, I want to add some extra detailing to this here, because at the moment it looks a little bit flat because it's just basically a flat surface with an opacity map. But I want to have like the appearance that there's some bright side here from where the sun is coming from, some darker area here, which is opposite to the sun basically. And we can easily achieve this by just using a bump map. And let's just take here the same map that we used for the opacity and also apply this here to the bump map as a copy. And then once you do this, you can see we have some kind of result, but it's not at all what we want. And let's fine tune this a little bit. Let's go inside here and let's go into the filter multiplier. By default, this one here is set to 1. We can increase this and that will overall soften the whole appearance. Let's increase this, for example, to 5. Once we do this, you can see that now we're getting a little bit closer to the effect we want. Let's make it even softer, something like 10 or 7.5 maybe. And now you can see we have like one side which is like brighter, the other side which is darker. It looks a little bit more like a volume. And now we just need to basically dial the correct bump map value. By default, that's here 30. Let's use a value of, for example, 10. And now this overall blends much better. So if I disable this one, it looks like this, so much more flat. And if I enable this bump map, you can see that it looks a little bit more like a volume. Let's do the same thing here from a bit further away. So this one is with the bump map, and then this one here without the bump map. So let's enable this again. And now I think we should be finished with our clouds in here. Now the only thing that we have to do is to add some kind of atmosphere so that we blend everything nicer together. And we also have this kind of like glow here on the edges, which makes the whole thing here looks like an actual Earth. And that's what we're gonna tackle now in the next step. So for the atmosphere, we will take the cloud layer, duplicate this, and let's call this here atmosphere. Also make a copy of this. Let's apply this material here for it. And then let's push this here to a value of 10, so make it much more big. And then this one here is our base geometry here for the atmosphere itself. And now instead of a standard V-Ray material, let's add a V-Ray light material. And now let's move to the slate material editor, because now the shading network gets a little bit more complicated. And I think like this, we have a better overview what's actually going on. So here we're in the slate material editor. Let's add something into the opacity map slot. For example, let's use a composite. And then once we have that, let's add something into the first layer in here. Let's use, for example, a falloff. Once we do this, you can see nothing really happens. And that's because you have to choose here this multiply color by opacity option. Once you do this, you can see that now here this falloff mask has an actual effect. And now we can fine tune that. We can, for example, add another point in here, and we can move this point down and then this one up. And then let's choose, for example, different kind of Bezier curve, something like this. And now we can move this point here to the left or to the right. Let's find something that we like. For example, something like this, where the brightest part of the transition here is just on the edge of our Earth geometry. So now we just move this part in here. And let's add a new color correction in here, put this through here. And then let's enable here a gamma correction of 0.4. So that we have this kind of like strong glow that's happening on the edge. We can then fine tune the position here a little bit. As said, if I move this here to the left, it goes inside. If I move it to the right, it goes outside. Just find something that this kind of glow here sits right on the edge of our geometry. Yeah, I think something like this should be fine. So now here the edges look fine, but what I don't like is that there's nothing here in the center of our Earth. And if I would go now and increase basically the base value in here, that's actually the effect that I try to achieve here for the center, but you can see it kind of screws up here the edges. So that's not really what we can do. We have to add a new layer. And let's also add a new falloff in here. And then this falloff, let's adjust it slightly differently. Let's move this one here up and then this one like this. And then let's put, for example, here another Bezier curve and move it roughly something like this. And now if I screen this here together, you will understand basically that I try to kind of eliminate this kind of gap in here. So for this, I just need to move this part here slowly to the right. And now this here is closed. You can see this edge here still looks intact. And we can choose a different kind of opacity intensity, let's say, for example, 50%. And like this, we also brighten up here the center of our sphere without destroying here the edges. So now we have a remaining problem, which is that here our atmosphere appears everywhere evenly on our Earth, and we only want to have this in the sunny area. We don't really want to show that here in the unlit area, of course. So for this, in our composite, we can add a new layer and then also add a new fall-off node in here. Let's move this down a little bit. And then let's switch this fall-off node here to shadow and light. And then let's add one point in here, move this up, and then transfer this like this way. And then we can set this one here to multiply. And once you do this, you can see that now the atmosphere here only appears in the lit area here of our Earth and not at all anymore in this area. Using this opacity slider here, we can then blend the intensity. So for example, like this, you could still see it a little bit, but let's use, for example, a value of 90 to just have it very subtle. We still have this like very subtle part here on the edges so that we can roughly see the shape here of our Earth. It doesn't completely disappear into darkness. And we have the atmosphere showing up on this side here of our planet. So now the only remaining issue we have is that our atmosphere is completely white. That's of course not really realistic for the Earth. You would kind of expect some bluish atmosphere. And for this, I prepared this very simple ramp in here. And I just gave it these kind of like dark to bright values, but with kind of like bluish in between tones in here. And then we can switch here this gradient type to mapped. And once we do this, we're able to load here our color correction map into the source map. And then we pipe this one here into the opacity instead. And once you do this, you can see that now this kind of gradient ramp in here is being mapped here with these kind of colors. And we get a much more realistic and nicer looking atmosphere for our Earth. So now as a final step, we could just go into our shader and then just define the intensity by playing with this multiplier in here. For example, let's use a multiplier of 0.75. Like this here, the overall intensity of our atmosphere is not that strong anymore, and it's kind of blending nicely together now. So now in here you can see the finished result. We have these kind of like city lights which only appear in the dark areas. We have here our clouds which cast some nice shadows here. We have these kind of mountains which are also illuminated correctly by the sun. And we have the sun itself which can move here in every area. And everything is correctly updated. You can see now the atmosphere is only in this part in here. And once you move that to here, for example, it only shows up in this part. So everything works like how you would expect that to. And this here basically concludes then the finished result of our whole Earth. So if you watched this video until here, chances are that you also enjoy the content that I provide over on my Patreon, where you can download the scene file for this tutorial and all of my other tutorials, and also can watch a whole course on car rendering. And there's also a lot of other bonus content. So head on over there if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, subscribe to his channel. See you in the next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.